Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to Protiotype's talk on design aesthetic and the built environment to address ongoing climate crisis for Bangkok Design Week. I'm Dana Blouin, and I'm joined today by my colleague from Protiotype and the founder, Greg Cornelius. Today, we're going to be taking a dive into some of the research around this topic and exploring the issues through the lens of design. I thought we'd start by getting a little bit of background from Greg. So, Greg, if you wouldn't mind, tell us a bit about yourself and Protiotype's mission.
Yeah, hi, Dana. Protiotype Design Science is an organization that's been around since about 2014. It's really like a special interest group of designers, scientists, and other people who are interested in these topics around new technology and how they impact on the world. In terms of my background, what to say, I guess I've been involved in design for 20 or more years in various roles in business. Yeah.
Nice. And today we're talking about an issue that some people may have heard of, the climate crisis, but how we can address that through a new aesthetic in the built environment. And climate, obviously, probably the greatest threat facing mankind today, climate change and the climate crisis. And I was looking at the research that we have at Protiotype, and you wrote this problem statement that the modern period of scientific progress has led us to a climate crisis of which the built environment is a significant contributor. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, sure. So for everybody who's tuned in today, we wanted to share that there is a paper which we'll share online, which people can read through. It's a bit dry and academic, so we don't expect everybody to read through it. But there were some key points that I wanted to express, and the best way to do that was just to write them out. And that's thinking about taking an historical kind of view and looking back at the situation we find ourselves in. And from a Protiotype's perspective, I think we've seen some aspects of our historical situation which are sometimes overlooked in the analysis and diagnosis of the challenges that confront us at this time. So I think from a statistical perspective, whenever we look at any charts, whenever we look at any numbers and analyze them, we're looking to break free of the noise of the data and look for signals in the data. And so in that paper, I've put up a couple of little charts that show human population explosion. And the human race has been around like 200,000 years. And we look at that data, it's flat for 200,000 years. And then the last 400 or 500 years, it really ticks up dramatically.
Seems like we might have figured a few things out.
Yeah, so that's a signal. You look at that data and go, this is a signal. Something unusual is going on in the time that we live in. And that population explosion, Dana, it's caused rapid urbanization. It's caused the growth of cities, which caused the Industrial Revolution, which has led to the growth of cities exponentially.
Now, I know I was looking at that chart in the paper, and like you said, it's been flat, almost like very minor growth for so long. And I believe we hit our first billion in the 70s. Is that right?
First billion about 1800.
Oh, 1800 was the first one. And then, oh, that's right. And then it took like over 100 years for the second billion. And now by
24 years.
Now by 2021, we're going to be at like 10 billion.
Yeah. By the end of the century, we'll hit 10 or 11 billion, and we're at 7.7 billion now.
So where do we fit everyone?
Yeah. Well, it's caused us to need a lot more housing, hasn't it? And it's caused the rise of cities. So I think with the shortness of our human lives in the context of the 200,000 years of humanity or the 4 billion years of the planet, we lose a little bit of perspective on how unusual the time we live in is. The time we live in is quite different to what's been the standard before.
You and I both live in two very densely populated areas. You in a very modern city, me in a very ancient city, both with very high density. Right. And you talk about your new aesthetic. And I wonder, like, one, why is now the time for this aesthetic, Greg? And then two, how does it address, how does a new aesthetic address somewhere like Singapore, where you're based, which is like modern, cyberpunk, futuristic, versus somewhere like Bangkok, where I live, which is, a millennia old and is dealing with all these like changing infrastructures and old infrastructure versus new and expansion and all these things. So one, why is now the right time for this aesthetic? And two, how does it address this sort of smorgasbord, if you will, of design requirements and needs?
Sure. Okay, good question. So important to understand a little bit about how the culture of design has evolved and how it exists around the world at the moment. And I think it's true to say, and I'll make some criticisms in the paper about modernism, which I'm really generalizing about as the ethos of design that exists in our design culture. And the ideas of modernism have their origins very deeply in Western culture. And modernism has come under criticism quite frequently as a form of sort of cultural imperialism. And that's how we see, what we see with modernism is a reductive process that makes everything the same. Modernism is about a monoculture, and it's about one view of the world. It may not have been purposefully done this way, but it has unfolded as a particular kind of view which has imposed itself around the world as we've had globalization since the Industrial Revolution.
It makes sense. I mean, even like we look at essentially every skyscraper that sits in a city, right, is at its core broken down to these minimal parts to build it as big and tall as quickly as possible, just despite what the aesthetic of it may be, whether it's Art Deco or brutalism. It's that style of building, that built environment has always been, for the most part, sort of stripped down to its core elements in a modernist way, has it not?
That's right. And I think what's important to understand there is that modernism has been successful, even though it's been criticized. So the criticisms of modernism, which have come in the last 100 years and then in big waves and 40 or 50 years ago, haven't been able to break down that monoculture and allow us to reflect a multicultural world and the reality that is. You talk about the smorgasbords of differences between cities. They've become sort of homogenous because modernism is so powerful, because it's a product market fit with the current business practices, of industrialization and so on. All of those things which underpin the problems of the climate emergency. Modernism's been historically a really great fit with those business practices. And that's fine for a while, but as our population has grown so much, as our cities have grown so much, we find that those business practices, those ways of designing, those ways of building, if they are done in an unsustainable way, are problematic, and the problems are getting bigger as we go on. So one point I make in the paper is that by 2050, the World Green Building Council has told us that because of the continuing population explosion and rapid urbanization, the size of the built environment on the planet will need to double. So what we have now, we're only halfway there. By 2050, we're going to have twice as many buildings as we've got now. And if we continue to build those as concrete, unsustainable, carbon-intensive buildings, we're just going to amplify the problems of the climate emergency. But this perhaps now can answer your other question is, why is it important to have a design movement or new design aesthetic? And to be honest, the only reason to do it is to just try and draw everybody together to realize that this is what we need to do. We need to make a kind of symbolic and fast-moving change in the way that we're going about designing and building. And in the culture, actually in all areas of culture, from time to time, we'll make up or we'll construct these idea of movements. It happens in the music industry. You might have rock and roll, punk rock, or whatever,
K-pop,
electronic, K-pop. These are concepts or movements which people are able to grasp in culture. And in the world of design and architecture, that's what's happened as well, particularly in this modern period, and then through the 20th century, late 19th, 20th century, all of those movements from Art Nouveau, Art Deco, brutalism, you can list them, there's a whole lot of them, through to postmodernism, deconstructivism, parametricism. They help us to pull together and aesthetic, but also to express ideologies and points of view. And what I'm saying is now we've got ourselves into this situation in 20 years into the 21st century where we have a climate emergency, but because of the product market fit of modernism with the business practices of the past that have caused this climate emergency, there's an inertia in modernism, and we need to find a way to abruptly draw attention to the fact that we need to change course. And so I think in the case of design, what is entirely appropriate is a new aesthetic movement to think about what are the different ways that we could design that are, green and sustainable, and how might we express that stylistically. And I think that I give some answers in the paper that's around putting forward some stylistic opposition to modernism. So the things that modernism is about, minimalism, reductivism, monochromatic, monocultural, mathematical, we try to do the opposite. So we should be thinking about multiculturalism, color, complexity, computation, and so on, and building out and green, right? So instead of being mass produced and a burden on the environment, we will use our computation and all of our technologies to build colorful, multicultural, pluralistic, green, sustainable, ecological architecture. So people walking down the street can see it and know, oh, hey, this is a point of change in our culture.
So you think it should be something that's just incredibly bold and stark contrast to the existing aesthetic that we see every day?
I would like it to be, but one of the things I talk about in the paper is that one of the problems with modernism was that it was the European architects that came out and prescribed their utopian view of what they thought architecture should be, and it got imposed on other cultures and other peoples around the world. And I don't want to be guilty of that same thing. So I think it's important that each culture, each population is able to express their own spirit. That's really important.
I'll tell you, one of the things I really love about living in Bangkok is that you can see the layers of design in the city. I can go for a walk and I can see an ancient temple in the middle of the city, and its backdrop is very modern Art Deco skyscrapers, clean, sleek glass sitting in the middle of Bangkok. And then next to it could be $1 million home that looks like it was plucked out of New England. And on the other side, some shanty houses. So there's this design aesthetic, or an old classic raised tie wood house, so there's all these different aesthetics coexisting together in a sort of heterogeneity in the city that I find interesting. Now, one of the terms that you coin, I'll say, in your paper is tech nouveau. I want you to explain that to us a little bit more. Let's dive into tech nouveau and what that means for this built environment that you're talking about.
Yeah, so I think it's important to give some sort of name to the aesthetic so that we can rally around it. But it doesn't actually matter what that name is, and if somebody can come up with a better name.
Probably not going to be too hard, Greg. Not going to be too hard.
That's right. Yeah.
I'm just joking with you.
Yeah, and all I was thinking is that new technologies are important for us. So one of the ways we're going to solve the climate emergency is by using all of those technological instruments that are available to us. Yeah.
So what role do you think tech will play? Is it a material science role? Is it computational? Is it AI driven? Is it is it all of that? Is it one of those? I don't know.
I think that it's probably all of those, Dana, but the key thing for me is that it's scientific. That as designers, and I say we call ourselves design scientists, it's about acknowledging the impact that the scientific revolution has had on our society, and then embracing the scientific method and bringing a little bit of scientific rigor to our design process. So that says we use those technological tools, whatever they are, they need to be used in a purposeful scientific way in order to advance towards those outcomes that we want in terms of carbon transformation.
Yeah, no, again, you talk about the scientific revolution and the problem statement, and really technology, science in general has changed every aspect of our life, right? Why has it been so slow to improve the built environment?
Yeah, well, that's a big question.
Yeah, you don't have to answer now, but
but it is interesting. You know, when I was doing some of my research, I found that people in the 18th and 19th century, when they started to see the population explosion, they said, this is going to be a disaster. There's going to be famine. We can't possibly produce enough food to feed all of these billions of people that we project are going to live. And the reality was that science adapted and made it so that we could produce enough food to feed the billions. Unfortunately, that's had other impacts. So, you know, important now that we think about what do we do? It's like, how do we, science is a very powerful instrument, and we need to solve these problems. Then as designers, I think we need to embrace science as part of the solution.
I would fully agree with that statement. And so, you know, with that, you know, how will a designer interact and use the tech that we're talking about to, you know, change the built environment and impact the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think you're right to point at computation. You know, I think, you know, as we go forward, it's about human designers working with algorithms, you know, leading algorithmically. So whether you call that AI or whatever, I think it's human intelligence augmented by machine intelligence, helping us to get where we want to go.
Yeah, definitely. I see it going that way. As someone who's a former data scientist as well, I mean, the tools are at our fingertips, right? If we're not using them, then we're leaving a lot of opportunity on the table. So I think with that, Greg, let's wrap up the talk for today. Do you have any final thoughts on, you know, the direction of the built environment to address the climate crisis, or design in general, that you'd like to leave us with?
There's a couple of points which I didn't put in the paper, which I think are important. One is that if we're really going to rally around and address the challenges that the built environment has in terms of impact on the climate crisis, that this needs to be a multinational approach. So it's Harari who said nationalism cannot solve global problems, and I think that's true. It's about all of us cooperating, using the free trade agreements to help countries cooperate with one another, pooling all of our resources and building powerful economic models to solve these problems. So that's what I would call that, you know, using the instruments, using our most powerful instruments to solve that problem. And those powerful instruments are things like our political economy. The politicians need to come on board. The economy needs to underwrite. We need to find the business models where capitalism can help to encourage the production of the right kind of cultural artifacts for us, and green, sustainable buildings, ecologically sustainable, economically sustainable, built at scale, in order that we can manage this ongoing population explosion and rapid urbanization.
Yeah, that's a great point. That, you know, yeah, if you can build an economic model to lead the way, the markets will follow, right? So I mean, that it's very dependent on that. So I think that's a great place to leave it, and a great kind of thought to take away from this that people can sort of chew on. So with that being said, guys, the paper that Greg is referencing that we're talking about today is available on Protiotype.com. We'd like to thank Bangkok Design Week for hosting this talk. And if you guys have any questions, you can reach out to us through Protiotype.com. Links will be in the description for this talk and the notes. So thank you very much. Greg, thank you.
Thanks, Dana. Bye-bye.